Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr. This is episode 360 of CryptoBiography, and it is a story called A Resting Place. It's part of the Connections continuity, and here we go. It was on Saturday, the 10th of August, 2024, that Alex first felt ill. He hadn't really enjoyed his breakfast and had skipped lunch. He'd made one of his favorite bachelor meals, tacos with lots of hot sauce, and he'd only taken one bite when he simply felt awful. It wasn't the food. It tasted, on some level, exactly as he expected, but something was making him nauseous. He just stopped eating and breathed, looking at the food on his plate, both wanting and not wanting to eat it. He put the food in the fridge, then went to bed, hoping it was just a passing bug. But it didn't help. He tossed and turned and simply couldn't get comfortable. He finally got up and went back to the kitchen. A perfectly good Saturday ruined, he thought. I'm going to have to stay inside and try to get better. He scrolled on his phone and listened to some podcasts, but he couldn't be entertained. He took his tacos back out of the fridge, but as soon as he opened the container and caught a whiff, his stomach churned and he put it back. The sun was starting to go down and he was exhausted. He went and took a shower. Usually he enjoyed a hot shower, but this time he found that as he turned the temperature down, he enjoyed it more. In any case, the lukewarm water seemed to help both his stomach and his rattled nerves. He took a long time in the shower, in fact not really wanting the shower to end, but he finally did turn the faucet off and got out of the shower. He tailed himself off and went straight to bed, not putting a stitch of clothing on. He woke in the morning, ravenous, but not sure what he wanted to eat. He pulled on some pajama pants and went straight to the kitchen, but found himself wandering around from cupboard to pantry to refrigerator. He picked up a lot of different foods, but every time he smelled them, they didn't appeal to him. Finally, he looked out his kitchen window at his backyard. He wasn't much of a gardener. The back lawn was fairly wild, and there was, instead of grass, moss between the 3 trees in the corner. The trees were apple trees, and it was the time of year they started to bear fruit, even without his help. An apple sounded good. So Alex put on his knock-around shoes and went out back. He went up to the biggest of the 3 trees. About 4 years ago, he had hired a tree surgeon to prune the 3 trees so they weren't budding branches, but that was so long ago that now they all touched. Still, the lowest branches had been pruned, and after a bit of a head duck, he could stand up when he was inside the umbrella of the outer limbs. He put his hand on the trunk and smiled. It felt like putting his hand on the shoulder of an old friend. This was in some ways strange, because he'd never been sentimental about plants before. He only thought about these apple trees when he had to. But that was the past. Now he found himself grinning up at them, enjoying their simple presence. He didn't reach for an apple. It didn't turn his stomach as the other foods had, but he just didn't want it either. Without realizing it, he found he had kicked off his right shoe. He wasn't wearing a sock, so his foot felt the dirt and the moss. Immediately he felt tired. Normally he treated sleep like an enemy, one to be held back as long as possible and then, once succumbed to, maintained for as short a time as possible. But this tiredness or sleepiness or exhaustion or whatever was different. It felt like part of his life had been missing, and now he had found it. He lay down on the moss, and though there was also dirt beneath him, he didn't mind much. His mind wandered and became unfocused. He thought of the skies, barely visible between the branches, and the trees, and the earth below him, and the moss. He wondered when it would next rain. He found himself falling asleep. Though part of him was hungrier than ever, he was increasingly not minding that. He woke up an unknown amount of time later. There was a light rain falling on his face. But he didn't mind. In fact, it felt wonderful. He wasn't hungry any longer. He felt quite satisfied. Soon he couldn't tell the difference between waking and dreaming. He hadn't moved in a long time. but he felt no need to be anywhere else. At some point, he was no longer there, or at least he was not there in any way that anyone who knew him would be able to recognize him. A few days later, his co-workers and his niece, the closest relative he had, convinced the police to let them go into his house to look for him. They only ever found his shoes, which were under the 3 apple trees, and his pajama pants, half buried in a mass of soft soil, bearing the starts of many small mushrooms. And that's the end of the story. This obviously is a little short, but sometimes, the stories have to be the length they are. And for some reason, I thought about lengthening this one, and every time I started to do that, it didn't feel like it needed to be any longer than this. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, cryptobiography@gmail.com. Hit us up on Facebook or Mastodon or X. And thanks for listening. Words and music copyright 2024, Brandon Starr, all rights reserved. Characters and events are fictional, fictionalized, or satirical.